Yeah, the thing is, and I think we felt this a lot during the pandemic, it becomes so much of the norm, it's hard to resist. I live in Manhattan, and I since my kids were small, we go out to dinner a lot. And it was hard at the beginning because you have three children grabbing food, water is spilling everywhere. And last night I went out with my daughter, she's 15 now, and we walked into our favorite restaurant. And the first thing we saw was this family with kids, and the kids were with their iPads.
Yeah,
And obviously, it is exactly what you're describing, and it's much, much easier to do it this way. And if you start seeing it all around you, it just you're not sure if you can fight it anymore. And during the pandemic, it was impossible. I mean, parents had no childcare; they had to work at home, and I think something sort of broke. They could just not manage this anymore. Taking the screens away, and in some ways, I'm not sure we can go back to what happened before that,
yeah.
unless
I
things
thought that
change.
was a fascinating part of your book is drawing attention to that this technology became so necessary during the pandemic and necessary and valuable as a way to survive it, as a way for many people to work away from work to work at home, but with a cost, I have to say, because Daddy's working. I'll I'll be out in an hour, but right now this hour is mine. I've got to work here. Go play. You just keep the door shut and play with your toys. Some version of that. So it's such a push pull situation.
Yeah, I think it's very hard, and also it's so lucrative to just give up. It's so easy to just it also I think part of it is because I I know I as I mentioned I ran this outreach program for parents in which I talked to lots of parents from 2017. And I know lots of parents tried very hard. You know, they would
Yeah,
limit time, phones and meals, they would limit them at bedtime, they would put apps, but it didn't really work. Screen time just went up. Maybe it worked with small kids, but not with once the kids got to middle school. So I think when you feel powerless, then it's much easier to say, okay, I'll just let them be with the screens. And the big step that I am promoting in the book is that this is a form of neglect, not, personal child neglect, but a generational neglect. You
yeah,
leave a
yeah.
whole generation of children in front of their screens saying we cannot do anything. What I'm trying to say is, yes, it's very, very difficult to use self-help to change anything, but there's lots of things that we can do to change things in a more systematic way.
Yeah, yeah, it's a structural issue. Uh, a society, with the way our society has evolved, is currently a structural issue and needs to be addressed at that area, at that level, right?
Right. I think there has, first of all, I think the good news is there's already a lot happening. It just sometimes it's hard to see the forest from the trees because the different movements are very different. So that we see things. First of all, the first thing that happened, I would say, which is really important, is that people are aware of the problem. And that's not a small thing because when I started speaking to parents in 2017, people were surprised. They all thought, oh, it's just something is wrong with my child. And just realizing that this is something that affects lots of people, being aware of it is a very important step towards solving it. And beyond that, we are already seeing things changing in other ways. We can see small scale things happening. You know, some schools, for example, prohibit cell phones even during
Yeah,
recess.
right.
We There are lots of laws that limit screen time and daycare settings, and there've been a lot. And I think there's and there have been lots of attempts so far unsuccessful in big legislations like social media addiction laws. And I think that it's important to note that failure is not necessarily failure. Like we talked about cigarettes, things go on for a long time. They may fail, but then they get attention. Pressure is exerted on the industry, and things eventually change. So there are many legal routes I could talk about, which in which we are already seeing action taking place, and and it's not going to be a magic pill. There's not going to be one law, one Supreme Court case that's going to change everything. It's not going
Yeah,
to happen like that.
right, right.
But it's already happening in many directions.
Yeah, well, in fact, you're a lawyer. We didn't talk about your current job. You might want to tell us about that because it seems like you've positioned yourself, I don't know whether by accident or happenstance or what, but it seems like you've positioned yourself to be in a pivotal role to get to be able to address these sorts of issues. How did that come about? Tell us what your job is and how it came about.
So it's I basically have I've been an academic writing about technology for years, and I was always interested in something a bit different from many of my colleagues. I was interested in how people use technologies and how it affects their lives. And when I started noticing I think people everything starts personally and then become at least for me becomes part of my work. When I started noticing how I remember one day I walked out of a yoga class in New York City, and maybe I was in a different mood. I went into a coffee shop and I stood in line, and I didn't take my phone out, which was unique because that's what we usually do. And so I looked around me, and there were 15 people standing in line, and nobody was looking up. And I thought, this is so strange. I've not noticed that before.
Wow, yeah.
And 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 then I started, you just start noticing more and more what is happening around you. And I noticed, for example, I would go to see my kids end of the year shows, and I could not really see them because all the rows in front of me were holding iPads and cameras. Nobody's really interacting with a show. They were all looking through their cameras, making sure they're recording it. And around that time, my law school, Seton Hall Law School, started Institute for Privacy Protection, and I became the director.
Mm.
And the natural thing would have just to do programs about privacy, and this was 2016. But I was already thinking about that, so I decided I want to go to schools to teach kids at the age when they get their first cell phones about privacy, but not just privacy, about what I thought was this really important thing, how to balance online and offline life. And so I created this program, and my law students went and taught the kids, and I went to speak to the parents. And from speaking to the parents, I think I first of all learned how much at first they had no realization what the issue was, but and they just when they did, they wanted to know how to fix it. And at first, I was actually going to write a different book. I was going to write this book about how we should increase awareness through legal tools. And but after about a year or two, it became clear that the parents were desperate, that nothing was really, really working. And around that time, evidence started coming out from Silicon Valley, the different whistleblowers, first Tristan Harris, later Francis, the Facebook whistleblower, and Francis Hogan. And data started piling up about the harms, especially for children. And I realized that the book I'm going to write, it has to be different. It has to be a book which is more about what can be done legally, how we can exert pressure on technology companies to redesign their products, for spaces or governments to enact laws, because this is not going to happen by itself. Once I realized how manipulative technology companies were, I thought I have a double job here. First of all, to document what's already happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I spoke to lawyers who were doing class action litigations. I looked everywhere to see where action was taking place. And then I drew a roadmap for where things are starting out and what else could be done, realizing that in many ways things are urgent.
Yeah, yeah. And the lead, I think, may happen in other countries first, as you point out. I'm aware that Apple Computer, I've been a big Apple fan for many years, although we're having to rethink that along with everything else. But they're really being called to account in a number of European countries around privacy issues and other kinds of issues of their, how they structure their charges, all of that, and and so Apple and other countries, other companies, technology companies in particular, are being confronted by this new globalization that we have, where other countries are important too. They're not all Americans out there, and they have their own government, their own rules, their own biases, and all of that. And if they're large enough, they can exert some real weight. Like take China for example. If you want to sell your devices in our country, where you know we have enormous power, you're going to have to march to our tune.
Yes, definitely. I think the fact that other countries are more advanced in regulating tech companies does have an impact. We saw this with privacy in Europe. The GDPR privacy laws in Europe are much more advanced than here. But then we got a law in California, which is much more advanced than any US law beforehand, which was inspired by the European laws. I think what's interesting to see that there's also already some regulation taking place about for technology overuse. So there's something called loot boxes, which is something that kids know a lot about, adults know less.
I know less. I
And
encountered that. I encountered that term in your book. I meant to go online and look it up. I felt like, well, I have some vague understanding. What is a loot box?
so a loot box is a very, very common features in online games. And so let's say you play a game and you have a character and you want to get extra strengths. So you can play and play and play, and eventually you might be able to get enough points, or maybe you're impatient and you want to get you want to get it right away. So loot boxes are basically these they take different shapes, but you don't see what's inside. So you get them, and inside you might get the sword you want or the extra powers you want, but you don't know what's going to be inside. So,
Oh,
and
oh, so
what
it's a
happened,
like surprise package. And, and
right?
so, I
Surprise
mean, I can
package.
see the manipulative power of that in terms of, oh, there's a goodie in here. You don't know what it is. It could be very wonderful. So it's essentially gambling.
Exactly. It is gambling because online companies basically let people buy these. So the moment kids can spend money on this, and some of them spend lots of money using their parents' credit card, that really raised the alarms. And so many countries in Europe prohibited or restricted loot um, boxes. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission held a workshop. It has not taken action yet. There is a lot of litigation against loot boxes. Again, not necessarily successful yet, but if you look at the documents of the litigation, they're not just talking about the money aspect, they're talking about how these games are addictive. So if we take loot boxes, the model on which it operates is a model that's all over the internet. It's called the intermittent reward model.
Yeah.
The idea is that once if we get a reward once in a while, we don't know when we get it, we're going to release more of dopamine, the pleasure enhancing neurotransmitter. And so if that's very much like the slot machine. If you take the slot machine, why do people keep pulling and pulling the lever? They never know when they'll get money, so they keep going. So many of the things we see online are operating on the same thing, whether it's uh, likes we get on Facebooks, or if people go on Tinder and they swipe and they don't know if they're going to get a match. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So the expose that discussion of the loot boxes is it's sort of the low hanging fruit because the kids and money, it's easy to get it outlawed, but it's exposing a lot of what's going on here.
Yeah.
And I think that is really the first step. And we can see actually in Canada, there's already a very important case against Fortnite, which is not just looking at loot boxes, but it's all basically suing Fortnite for being addictive as cocaine.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Again, I have to hold my colleagues in psychology accountable. I mean, complex schedules, intermittent complex schedules of reinforcement go all the way back to Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and his followers, and and they were able to control animals to get them to do extraordinary things and to basically get so addicted that they would work themselves to death for these on these reinforcement schedules. And again, these insights and tools are being turned against us. Um, so, but I'm glad that you're not discouraged and that you are going to keep plugging away because we need people like you at the forefront of this. And are you ever concerned that some of these people might realize, wait a second, she's kind of a threat to our industry, that they might come after you one way or another?
Well, I think the people who were the biggest threat to the industry were the people who revealed information. The whistleblowers,
Oh,
Frances Haugen, Tristan Harris. I think at this point, there's so many people working together. Maybe people do not see it, but the moment, I think in a way, my book is coming out in a good timing
oh yeah,
because there's a lot of evidence, a lot of scientific evidence. There is a lot of evidence coming from the companies themselves. And there are lots of great people, lawyers, legislators, parents, educators already working. So I think I see my role here is of basically drawing the whole pictures, showing the options. But I'm coming at a moment that I think that movement is already in motion. I'm not here, the lone person, saying what's going on.
uh-huh, good, good. Um, what's your hope? Well, who's your audience for this book? Who do you want to buy this book, and why should they want to do that and read it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think I would have answered this question differently before the pandemic than after the pandemic. I think after during the pandemic, especially during lockdown, lots of people felt very vividly what it means to be in front of screens all the time. They felt it in their bodies, they felt it
Uh,
in their mood. And if before the pandemic, it was more parents who were concerned about their kids, I think there are lots of adults now who just do not want this, but they not know how to stop this. So I think it's more of a general audience book than it would have been if I had published this 4 years ago. And so one group is just people wanting change and parents wanting change. And then there's the group of many people who are doing work that's related to this, whether they are teachers. I mean, what's going on in the classroom is very concerning. The general policy is to have as much technology in the classroom as possible. And is this the right decision or not? This is something education policy has been going only in one direction for over a decade now. And I think there are lots of decisions that could be decided on a federal level, on a state level, and an individual school level. I think that also the people working in the technology industry hopefully want to do better. And lawyers, of course, policymakers.
Yeah.
And there are lots of professionals whose work is related to this.
Well, good. Yeah, I think it's a book that probably everybody needs to read and should read, and it's not just children. I mean, we all need to be aware of this dynamic of how it's seductively easy to hang out with our screens. I know somebody. I have a friend who's about my age, and their adult son came to visit, and oh boy, this would be time for a great sharing, right? And they find out what's going on in their lives, etc. But and they could do that around watching sports on TV. But what happened was that my friend's adult kids were communicating with their friends on their iPhone about the game that everybody was watching on the TV. So that in fact, for the parents, and this is an age-old thing of parents feeling, oh, you never write, we don't hear from you, you don't call. Well, now here they are, but they're not with you.
Yeah.
They're not with you. You're watching the same event, but it's being hashed out elsewhere with other people you don't even know.
Yeah, Sherry Turkle, one of my favorite writers, wrote a book called Alone Together, which I think really captures what you've
Uh-huh.
been describing. I think for me, I felt this also for the first time in 2016 when Trump unexpectedly won the elections against Hillary Clinton. And I think nobody really thought this was going to happen. And there were lots of people sitting together in the living room. And I was surprised that nobody was talking. Everybody was on their phone texting. People were not there looking for their own news information. Nobody was even looking at the TV. And I remembered when I was a kid, people always complained about the TV. And on the other hand, compared to this, the TV is like the human bonfire because at least on the TV, everybody is watching the same thing together and talking about the same thing, not looking at individual screens and living in different world.
Yeah, your term, the human bonfire, reminds me of the book Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe book. And
Yeah.
that might be relevant. And I guess it's relevant in the sense of the power of mass culture kind of co-opting our depth. And we're easily bought off and pursue vanities.
Yeah.
Vanity, oh vanity. Yeah. So I think you've written a fine book. You're doing us a good service here. And I'm glad you're out there doing it because it needs to be done. And
Thank you.
yeah. Anything more that you want to say to as we wrap it up here?
I think just my hopes for the book my hopes for the book is that it will I think too many people feel powerless. My hope is that by looking at what can be done and how it's done on in small places, whether in your school or your school district, or lots of laws are local, not even state level. There's so many options to be active and to change things and not to feel desperate, like this is the way it is. We're just heading towards this future and there's nothing else to do about it. And the second thing is and we started from that. I love technology. I'm not against technology. I
Yeah.
think what we need to do is to try to find a better balance here, because this is too lopsided. And if we keep heading this way, with the metaverse, with smart cities, we're we're heading into a very, very specific future. So there's something that happened, I think, with the pandemic that you can see clearly where we're going. And there's a window of opportunity to try to make different decisions. And I think we can make different